Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to have so many of you come. I want to especially thank Tova and the library for sponsoring this talk. And I hope all of us have a wonderful weekend, and I hope the weather continues to barely cooperate as it did today. First, an advertisement, which is, as Tova mentioned, what this talk is being sponsored in part by the library. Come on, computer. There we go. Okay. And that is, this is from the library's webpage. It announces the talk today, and more importantly, it talks about the exhibit, the Darwin exhibit, including a large number of original letters and other manuscripts, which is available to John Hay. And any of you interested in the development of this extraordinary idea, I think you'll find this to be a most rewarding exhibit. One never knows how one is going to be introduced. So I always like to bring along my own introductory slide, although what Tova just told you is largely accurate. I am a cell biologist. I actually work on biological membrane structure and function. Most of the research I've done has involved the electron microscope and subcellular structure. So you might ask yourself, how does a nice cell biologist get involved in a business like evolution? Well, the answer actually turns out to be very simple. You allow a former student of yours to talk you into doing something absolutely ridiculous. And in this case, that former student was a fellow named Joseph Levine, and he approached me quite a while ago and said, how about we write a high school biology textbook together? I immediately told him what he could do with that idea, and it took him the better part of 6 months to convince me that this would be an interesting thing. We spent quite a bit of time on it. When the books finally came out, they became nationwide bestsellers. How does this get you into evolution? Simple. And that is, our books have a very strong treatment of evolution, and about 40% of the high school classrooms in the United States teaching biology at the introductory level use one of our books. And that means whenever a local school district has a problem with evolution or someone protests the teaching of evolution, as often as not, it's our book which is held up, it's our book which has warning stickers put on it, or it's our book that in one case has its pages glued together so that students cannot read the material on evolution. When I speak at university campuses to audiences of college students, I will usually preface this part of this slide by saying, many of you may already know me and you may not like me. And the reason for that is if you used any of these books in high school, and trust me, when I say this to a college student audience, it elicits groans everywhere because they can remember carrying these books around in their backpack. Now, I've been blessed with two daughters, one of whom is a Brown grad, Tracy, who is a history major in the class of '02. My oldest daughter, Lauren, who's a wildlife biologist, actually managed to escape from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts, where we lived before the high school adopted one of our books. But Tracy was not so lucky. So Tracy had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's textbook for biology in high school. That, I suppose, is why today she's a history teacher. But in any event, you might think it's a good thing to have your own local schools actually start to use a book that you wrote. And to some extent, I guess it is. I live in Rehoboth, which is about 10 miles east of here. It's a very small town, about 8,000 people, mostly rural. And for years, a lot of people in town knew who I was. But it wasn't because of what I did for a living. It was because for almost 10 years, I was kind of like the commissioner of the girls' softball program in Rehoboth. So I would run our spaghetti suppers to raise money. I trained our umpires. In the summer, I coached one of our all-star teams. So everybody knew Mr. Miller as the softball guy, but they didn't really know what I did for a living. So one day, the high school adopted the book with the elephant on the cover. My cover, so to speak, was blown. Suddenly, everybody knew what I did. So about a month into that school year, I'm driving up to DR to pick up Tracy after field hockey practice. I pull in front of the high school, and there's a woman there named Bonnie Kelly, former coach who knows me from softball. And Bonnie flagged me down. Bonnie said, Ken, you wrote the book that they use in the high school now. And I got that big dumb look on my face that you get when you think someone's about to compliment you. And I puffed out my chest and I said, yes, Bonnie, I did. And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, funny thing is, you don't seem that smart. And I was never quite sure how to take that. My wife assured me it was a compliment. But my wife is a RISD grad, so those judgments are not always reliable. As Tova was kind enough to mention, I've also written a couple of books for general audiences, one of which appeared about 10 years ago called Finding Darwin's God, A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution. When I wrote this, and people have been urging me to write this for a long time, I thought this would be a little book. And what I mean by little book is, I figured Mom and Dad would get a copy. My department chair would be amused to see a cell biologist write a book like this, and that would pretty much be it. To my absolute astonishment, this book is now in its 28th printing in paperback. And what that tells me more than anything else is the hunger that people have in the United States to see somebody address these issues. Well, a lot has happened since I wrote that book, and in the past year I published another book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, and much of what I'm going to talk about today actually comes from that book. Joel Levine and I are still busy at this, and in fact, just last month, a new textbook was published with a beautiful animal on the cover, naturally, and we can already anticipate that this book will be the focus of squabbles around the country, because if anything, we've increased the way in which evolution is woven into the fabric of biology in our new book, as indeed it should be. Just to let all of you know, and I've seen a few name tags here from class of '69, the class that was here when I was here. I wanted to make sure that those people who wonder, I don't remember that guy from when I was an undergrad. Naturally, I don't look the same. So I figured I'd help you out, but let you know what I looked like when I was walking around the campus in the 60s. I have my brown swimming sweatshirt on under there. I was a varsity swimmer, and I am here working in the laboratory of Andrew Holowinski, one of the two professors who sponsored me for independent study as an undergrad and got me on the road to research. And one of the things I've always treasured about this institution is the way in which it makes it possible for young people to embark on that kind of career, that kind of intellectual challenge that scientific research is built around. And I have to say, now that I'm on the other side of the desk or the other side of the podium or the other region in the laboratory, I appreciate that more than ever. Just 2 years ago, I was strolling along commencement on a nice sunny day, and I hope we'll have that on Sunday, and I was walking along with this guy. Now, I don't know how many of you recognize him, but I'll tell you who he is from my point of view as a faculty member. When I first came here to Brown, the very first course I taught was an upper-level course in cell biology. I only had 18 or 19 students, and this guy was in it. And I remembered this tall, dark-haired kid. He didn't get the best grade in the class, but he might have been the most inquisitive student ever. He never let me get out of the classroom without pinning me up against the blackboard and asking all sorts of troublesome questions. He wanted further reading. He was a really interesting guy. I knew he went on to grad school because in his senior year he did independent study in the laboratory in Nelson Fausto, which was right next to mine, and Craig was always coming next door to borrow and occasionally break equipment from my laboratory. I lost track of him for a while, and then all of a sudden I began to read his papers, and I discovered not only had he gone on to earn a PhD, he had gone on to do some research that was increasingly significant. How significant was that research? And why is he marching in Brown's commencement? And this is just 2 years ago. Very simple. That young person's name was Craig Mello, and 2 years ago he won the Nobel Prize in medicine or physiology for the co-discovery of a very important phenomenon called RNA interference. And I think one of the great things that I take pride in this institution is that we continue to turn out people like Craig, and I think a lot of those people are in this year's graduating class as well, and that gives me pride as both an alum and a faculty member. But let's get back to the topic at hand. One of the things about evolution that I think all of you know is that it's an issue that divides Americans. And if you'd like to do a little background reading on it, a couple of years ago, Time magazine actually had a cover story on evolution. They called what was going on in the US the evolution wars. They pointed out that most Americans actually seem to reject the theory of evolution. And they also pointed out that our president at the time had taken a position on evolution that a lot of us in the scientific community did not regard as especially helpful. I'm trying to be diplomatic, come on. But I have to tell you, look carefully at that picture. My co-author saw it, and he immediately called me up and he said, "Ken, look whose textbook they superimposed President Bush's face on." And lo and behold, yes, that was our textbook. And we were quite excited about that because, we're always looking for new cover art for our book. And when Texas adopts textbooks in a couple years, this could be just the thing. So if that's the case, you've heard that here. But to illustrate how contentious this issue is, in the space of just a little over a year, I actually ended up testifying in federal court in 2 trials revolving around the teaching of evolution. One was in Georgia and the other one was in Pennsylvania. About a year later, evolution was the issue in 2 statewide elections in 2 other states. And those states were Kansas and Ohio. Now, if you don't live in one of those states, you might wonder, what does a state election that turns on the issue of evolution look like and sound like? So to help you do a little research on that, what I brought in here is the front page of the largest newspaper in Ohio, the Cleveland Plain Dealer. This is about 10 days before the election in '06. And the elections at hand were the elections for the State Board of Education in both of those states. And as you can see, the front page Sunday issue, evolution debate at center of state school board race. And this article highlighted a contest for a seat in the Cleveland area between Deborah Owens Fink, a professor at the University of Akron who was the leader of the anti-evolution forces on the school board at the time. She was the incumbent, and her challenger down here, a guy with the very memorable name of Tom Sawyer. Here's what a talk show host in Cleveland told his audience this race was all about. He said, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponents. And with discourse like that, you might despair of democracy. You might wonder, how did this case actually turn out? Well, here's how it turned out. It turned out that the sin vote was a lot more influential than anybody believed because pro-evolution candidates swept the state school board elections in Ohio, and they also took control of the Kansas Board of Education, a position that they solidified in the 2008 elections. And what that tells me more than anything else is what is necessary to make the case for science. In both of those states, members of the scientific community, the educational, the medical community, even petroleum geologists in Kansas united to argue for solid science education in our schools. And I'm convinced that the American people in any state, and I don't care what it is, will choose science every time if they're actually given that choice. And if we in the scientific community are willing to climb down from the ivory tower and make our arguments and present science in a way that people can understand. All too frequently, that doesn't happen. However, if I also color in over a couple of years the number of states that have passed some sort of anti-evolution measure, I color in this many states, and if I color in states that are involved in anti-evolution activity at the local school board level, it's almost every state in the United States. And I show this in part because people in certain regions of the country, Northeast, West Coast, so forth and so on, often think, well, this is not a problem, it's a geographic thing. It's just for deep south, flyover country, something like that. It's not. This is a problem that is nationwide, and it matters in a big way. Now, the specific case I want to mention in particular took place in a small town in Pennsylvania called Dover. And what happened one day was that the school board of Dover voted to instruct their teachers to prepare a curriculum on something called intelligent design. And you can't make this up. This actually was the scoreboard outside Dover High School the next morning. And what they had done, basically, was to tell the teachers, we'd like you to start teaching this stuff. The science teachers in Dover, and there's only 4 of them, it's a small town, to their everlasting credit and at the risk of losing their jobs, refused. They told the school board publicly, this stuff isn't science. You should fire us if we did teach it. So what the school board did is they wrote their own lesson on intelligent design. They typed it out. They asked the teachers, will you at least read this to the kids? Once again, they refused. So the school board was reduced to sending the superintendent and the assistant superintendent into the classroom to read this lesson on intelligent design to the students. The next morning, 11 parents went to federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and they filed this lawsuit. The lawsuit is known by the name of the first person listed, and that is Kitzmiller. That's Tammy Kitzmiller, this unassuming woman in the blue blouse. Kitzmiller versus Dover, and it very quickly moved to trial. And as it turns out, in late 2005, this case was gavelled to order in federal court in Harrisburg. Now, what was going on here? I mean, did the school board just get together for coffee one morning and say, hey, let's revolutionize the biology curriculum? The answer is no. They were actually being manipulated. They had been persuaded by a group called the Discovery Institute, which published a book called Intelligent Design in Public School Science Curricula, a legal guidebook, that they could do this legally. The Discovery Institute, a very well-funded think tank, is based in Seattle, Washington, and they had been searching for a school board that could try this idea out. And it recommended all sorts of things, like the purchase of an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. Now, as this case moved close to trial, the advocates of this idea called intelligent design were very excited. And the reason for that is by the luck of the draw, and that's how this happens in federal court, they were able to draw a judge who had a reputation as a very conservative jurist and had recently been appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush and had been praised during his confirmation hearings as a strict constructionist. And some of them on their blogs fantasized about the possibility of getting Darwinists on the stand under oath and breaking them down under cross-examination so they would admit that evolution was just a lie. And what you see here is the NBC TV courtroom sketch of a representative Darwinist, that would be me, on the stand, apparently, by their count, getting broken down by cross-examination for the attorney from the other side. And you can actually see my textbooks and my popular books piled here on the table. Well, as it turns out, that's not quite what happened. The trial lasted for 7 weeks, and what actually happened was intelligent design simply collapsed as anything even remotely resembling a scientific theory. Now, I had the honor, and that really is the word I now appreciate, of being the lead witness in that trial. I figured I'd just spend a day on the stand. As it turns out, my cross-examination went on for 9.5 hours, and I ended up being on the stand for 2 days. But as I say, the trial went on for 7 weeks. And I was joined in this effort by an extraordinary group of people, the incomparable Eugenie Scott from the National Center for Science Education, Barbara Forrest, one of the great heroes of the trial from Louisiana. Now, Barbara Forrest, I say with some pride, is the most painful scientific thorn in the side of a Brown alumnus who currently happens to be the governor of Louisiana, because Barbara has continued to fight for evolution in the schools in Louisiana, and a whole host of other people. And one of the things that we all got a kick out of was the argument that this was a case of science versus God. And the thing that was surprising about that is, of the expert witnesses that you see up there, 4 of them are professing Christians, and one of them is actually a professor of theology at Georgetown University. We weren't against God at all, and it turns out among the 11 plaintiffs, 8 of the 11 plaintiffs are Christians, 2 of them teach Sunday school, and 1 of them runs a summer Bible camp. So the notion that this was some sort of secular humanist coalition against religion in schools was absolute nonsense. What happened at the end of the trial was this conservative judge came out with a ringing statement that intelligent design simply was not science, and he actually recommended that several members of the Dover Board of Education be investigated for perjury because of the statements that they had made during the trial. The judge told me later on, the district attorney said, come on, I got murderers, rapists, and drug dealers to prosecute. A few petty lies by school board members, small potatoes. But if you did not follow this case, you can now brush up on it in a video fashion, because public broadcasting took care of that. And if you didn't get to see the PBS show about this trial, I'm going to show you a little hint of what it was actually like.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
There's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turn, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial on Nova.
Now I hope that voiceover was dramatic enough for you. And I hope many of you actually got to see this show because it was absolutely extraordinary. If you didn't, for about $15 you can buy the DVD from Amazon. Is it worth doing? Absolutely. It won the Peabody Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism, so it was widely recognized as an extraordinary piece of video. Now, I would love to say that with this video, with the judge's decision, the trial and everything's cool. We've answered the arguments from intelligent design, and now we can go back to the laboratory, go back to the field, and do other things. Unfortunately, I don't think we can. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, and there are several points that I wanted to make in it. The first thing is, this battle is not finished. The second point is, it's not so much about evolution as it is an argument about the acceptance of scientific reason itself. And therefore, all sciences are actually under attack by this movement. And I think it really matters for this country's future. It matters to the extent of whether or not we are going to continue to be the leading scientific country in the world. And in fact, I think we are at a knife edge at this point in terms of whether or not we will continue to embrace science as we have in the past. Now, one of the really interesting things about this is even the most fervent advocates of this idea called intelligent design admit that scientifically it's a failure. The gentleman you see here is universally acknowledged as the intellectual founder of the intelligent design movement, the sort of reformulated scientific creationism that has appeared in this country in the last 10 years. And you might wonder, who is he? Where did this come from? His name is Philip Johnson. He's a professor of criminal law, and it's worth noting that intelligent design, like a lot of bad ideas, has come out of the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. Because that is, yeah, I know there are Berkeley alums out there, and that's why I'm positioning myself very close to the exit right now. And indeed, it's quite significant in many ways that this is a Berkeley idea, because Johnson was very much at home with academic lingo when he put this idea together. But in the aftermath of the trial, look what he said. I don't think there is a theory of intelligent design right now that we can propose as an alternative to the Darwinian theory. Now, he doesn't think evolution is right. He just says there's no intelligent design theory that's comparable. And he went on, and if someone asks you, why don't we teach intelligent design in the schools of our state or our city? Here's what the founder of this movement said. He said, no product is ready for competition in the educational world. We got nothing. And that's a very significant admission by the person who really is behind the intelligent design strategy. Despite that, it's a public relations success story. Now, this is one of those slides you're not actually supposed to see the data on, so don't be surprised if you can't read it. But this is the result of a survey of about 1,000 people in each of about 30 leading industrialized countries, basically asking them, do you accept the theory of evolution or not? And if you did, you're in blue. If you reject it, you're in red. If you're not sure, you're in the color in between. Now, I'm not sure if you can pick out the United States in there, so I'll help you out. The United States is right there. The only country we beat was Turkey. When this issue of Science came out 2 years ago, and we have a couple of really excellent Turkish graduate students in our graduate program here at Brown in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, one of these kids was strolling by my office, and I grabbed him in, and I said, have you seen this? And he took a look at it, and he saw the positions of these countries, and he put his head in his hands, and he said, I'm so ashamed. And I said, what are you talking about? He says, we couldn't even beat the United States. And I think that says something about the international perceptions of the American attitudes towards science. But let me show you some of the weapons that are used to basically drive evolution down to that low rating. One of those weapons, quite frankly, is intentional distortion of scientific reality. And one of the best examples of this was the very textbook that the Dover School Board wanted their kids to study from, called Pandas and People. One of the classic arguments used by anti-evolutionists is the claim that there are no intermediate or transitional forms in the fossil record. Pandas says exactly the same thing. Here are a couple of pages from Pandas and People, and they concentrate on part of our natural history called the transition from water to land by vertebrates. And they show that evolutionists are so stupid that they actually think that about 350 million years ago, lobe-finned fish like this Eusthenopteron gave rise to the earliest tetrapods, the earliest amphibians, like this Ichthyostega. And they show kids the bone structure of a lobe-finned fish and the bone structure of one of the limbs of an ichthyostega, and they basically say, can you actually believe that this magically changed into that? And specifically what they ask kids is how many different transitional species were required to bridge this gap? We don't know. But we do know that no such transitional species have ever been recovered. There's nothing in between them. Now, in graphic terms, what they were telling students is that on this line from fish to land vertebrates, we have a lobe-finned fish like Eusthenopteron, and we have an early amphibian with very fish-like characteristics, but an amphibian on the left called Ichthyostega, and we have nothing between them. We have an unbridgeable gap. Is that true? Well, even when this book was published, it wasn't even close to being true. What they had done was to deliberately omit two other transitional forms, a lobe-finned fish like Panderichthyes, which probably was actually able to lift itself out of the mud, like a mud skipper does today, and a much more fish-like early amphibian called Acanthostega. So rather than having an unbridgeable gap between fish and amphibians, this is actually a very well understood evolutionary transition. But today I want to go a little further. I want to look exactly at the critical part of the transition from water to land. And I want to ask ourselves the following question. Can we find a transitional form at the exact fish to amphibian transition, which would be right here? And I want to show you a little video of a scientist who led the expedition to search for exactly such a transitional form. Here it is.
In 1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between two great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Armed with this prediction, Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last year up there. And then in 2004, in the third day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just like exactly like this. And he removed more rock and more rock and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish of about 380 million years old. And when you see just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs, and the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, is a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Yet when you look at the head, you see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart. When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, what you'll see is bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fish.
So in other words, you have a transitional form that is so good, it's almost as though you drew it up on a drafting board and it fits exactly in the middle. But it turns out things got even better than that. Right after Neil and his colleagues published that paper, another transitional form was found in the same evolutionary region. This one is called Goganathus. It's more on the fishy side, and its bony fins include bones that we can map as the humerus, radius, ulna, and all the bones of the primitive wrist. So basically what we have is a situation like this. We already had a pretty good understanding of this transition. We now have Tiktaalik to plug in right here. We have Goganathus to plug in right there. So we have this transition in great detail. I have a former student and a bit of a wise guy who now teaches at Swarthmore College. His name is Colin Purrington, and Colin has a way with words. And Colin told me once, next time you get into a debate or an argument with one of these guys, don't mince a lot of words, don't show a lot of DNA sequences, that's tough to understand. End it all with one sentence. And this is the sentence that Colin proposed: we have the fossils, we win. But you might say, well, who really cares about the first amphibian? And that's true. The kinds of fossils that people really care about are fossils like these. This is a very interesting specimen, usually attributed to one of our ancestors called Homo erectus. This is a somewhat more primitive skull, tentatively named a couple of years ago Kenanthropus platyops. When this find was first published, and this is in the journal Nature about 6 years ago, along with the research paper came this summary. And it was a summary of all of the pre-human fossil species that we know in detail from just the last 5 million years. And as you can see, many people would argue, hey, there must become some kind of missing link or something like that. There's no missing link. We have so many specimens that the uncertainty is how to connect them. We're really not sure which one is our great-great-grandfather, which one is our great-great-aunt, our second cousin, the crazy uncle in the attic, anything along those lines. So that's the uncertainty, and it comes almost from an embarrassment of riches. But I have to tell you, when I opened that issue of the journal Nature, I looked at that diagram, and I thought, wow, where have I seen that before? And I was positive I had seen a diagram like that before. But how could I? Because this is like the latest issue of this scientific journal. And it took me a couple of days to realize why I had the sense of déjà vu from this. And I woke up one morning and I thought, I know where I've seen that before. In his book, The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin put exactly one figure. And it was a sketch of what he thought the fossil record would look like if it was complete for the evolution of a representative species. And here's part of the sketch. The reason I thought I had seen it before is because it's almost the spitting image of the sketch that Charles Darwin had made, almost back of the envelope in 1859. The old guy got it right, and he got it right the first time. So it's extraordinary to me that the human fossil record today almost precisely matches Darwin's idea of what evolutionary change should look like. But it actually gets better than that. One of our colleagues at the Dover trial, he wasn't an expert witness, but he was our resource guy, he was our smart guy behind the scenes, is now a grad student at Cal Berkeley, good ideas come out of Berkeley too, named Nick Matsky. And Nick, just about a year ago, came upon this really, really boring systemic paper. And it was variation in hominid brain size, how much is due to the measuring method. And what these guys had done was to take every single pre-human skull for the last 5 million years that we have a brain case size on and report on them. So when you look at this paper, at the end of it, you see tables like this. It's just dull, 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 specimen after specimen after specimen, and then some dry academic discussion. But Nick realized, wait a minute, there's something really cool in here. And what Nick did over several days is to type all this data into Excel. And then when you plot the data, what you get is a graph like this, with the age of the specimen, the cranial capacity, and he then color-coded this for the particular species in the fossil record. And what you see is a very smooth evolutionary transition with no gaps, no missing links, showing the way in which our brain size dramatically increased over just about 3 or 4 million years. So any notion of some sort of gap that needs to be filled between human and non-human primates is absolute fiction. And that, to me, is the most important part of the substantive findings that we have made, and we, I mean, of course, the scientific community, in the last several decades. Now, some of you may have heard all sorts of great stuff about a surprising new fossil find. This was trumpeted in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. And this has been, and I think much to the ultimate chagrin of the scientific community, this has been pinpointed as some sort of missing link. This lemur-like creature is actually about 43 million years old, and it doesn't show much about human evolution. What it shows is the early stages of the evolution of the whole branch of primates to which we belong. So if you're a chimpanzee and you're interested, or a gorilla or orangutan, you would be equally interested in this fossil as we are, because basically it's the evolution of the whole group of primates to which we belong. But there is no missing link in recent human fossil history, and that's something that unfortunately has become lost in the hype about this new fossil. Now, I'm not a paleontologist. Every time I see a fossil and I want to know something about it, I have to find Christine Janis on our faculty here, who is a real paleontologist, and Christine can tell me what it means. So when I went in to testify in the Dover trial, I wasn't going to talk about fossils, but I was going to talk about DNA. 2 weeks before this trial was gavelled to order in September 2005, Nature published the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome. This was earth-shaking. And one of the sentences from the lead article explains why. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we humans have recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. Indeed, they had. I actually called up our attorneys and I said, gentlemen, this is a gift from God. We have to bring this into the courtroom. And I meant that with all my heart, and you'll see why in a second. But the problem was, most of the info in here was very technical. If I got on the stand and I testified about the percentage of conservation of synteny, the judge's eyes would have just glazed over. So we had to figure out an easy way, with no offense intended to anybody in the audience. We had to boil this down into terms that were so simple that even an attorney could understand them. I have a feeling that's the non-attorneys in the room applauding. So here's what we did. And these are actually the slides that I showed the judge. We've known for a long time, fossil, biogeography, physiology, everything, that we're pretty closely related to these guys. But here's something that's kind of funny. We humans have 46 chromosomes. Now, all the biologists and medical people in the room know that we get 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad. So we actually have 23 pairs of chromosomes. All of the other great apes, without exception, have 24 pairs and hence 48 chromosomes. Why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Is it possible that in the lineage leading to us, a pair of chromosomes just got trashed and got thrown by the wayside? Well, the answer to that is no. You talk to any primate geneticist. The loss of both members of a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. You wouldn't even get past embryonic development. So the only possibility is the two chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates must have gotten accidentally stuck together in the lineage leading to us, leading to a single chromosome, and that would drop us from 24 pairs down to 23. So that's the explanation. But here's the cool part, and this is why evolution is science and not conjecture. If that happened, somewhere in our genome, we have a recently fused chromosome. And if we can find that, that's a powerful confirmation of a very specific prediction. But if we don't have a recently fused chromosome, you know what? The whole idea of human common ancestry is in trouble. You might even throw it out for lack of evidence. Now you might wonder, how would we identify a fused chromosome? Well, the answer turns out to be actually pretty simple. I've sketched a couple of chromosomes up here. The tips of chromosomes are covered at the telomere, at the end, with very special DNA sequences. They're highly repetitive, and they are very easy to recognize. They're only found at the tip. Near the center of every chromosome is an equally special region that you can also recognize by its DNA sequence called the centromere. If one of our chromosomes had been formed by the recent fusion of two primate chromosomes, do you know what it should look like? It should have telomere DNA where it doesn't belong, right in the center at the fusion point, and it should also carry two centromeres. So that's the test. We can look at our own genome. Do we carry a chromosome like that? Well, I'll spare you the suspense. The answer is we sure do. It's human chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2, this is also a paper from '05, has everything I've just described. It has telomere DNA in the center. It has two centromeres, one of which is inactivated, which makes it a little more stable in cell division, but it's still recognizable. And from the centromeric sequences, we can tell that this fusion came from primate chromosomes 12 and 13. Now, is there any way that one can understand these facts? And DNA sequences are not theory, hypothesis, or conjecture. They're facts. Is there any way we can understand these facts on the basis of a hypothesis that our species was uniquely created or specially designed? The answer is no. No, there's only one way to understand these, and that is in the context of evolution. About the only thing you could possibly say is that maybe the designer wanted to fool us into thinking we had evolved, and he rigged chromosome 2. And to be perfectly honest, if that's what he wanted to, he did a heck of a job, because the evidence for our common ancestry and evolution is written all throughout our genome. Now, only one of the powerful weapons used against evolution at evolution in our schools is the distortion or omission of the evidence. There's another powerful weapon too, and that is to spread the fear of evolution itself. Now, one of the people who did this for quite a few years was a distinguished United States Senator from the state of Pennsylvania named Rick Santorum. And I picked Senator Santorum for an ironic reason. Many of you may know that a federal judge, to be appointed, has to be approved or recommended by one of its state's senators in Congress. The senator who recommended Judge Jones for the federal bench, in fact, was Rick Santorum. So that decision came back a little bit later on. But Santorum, when he was hoping to run for president, and this is really true, in 2005, he wrote a book called It Takes a Family. I'm an addictive NPR listener, and I was actually listening to him being interviewed. And in the middle of the interview, the interviewer asked him, why does evolution, criticism of it, play such a prominent role in your book? And Santorum's answer was, he means evolution, has huge consequences for society. I mean, it's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose to our lives? Or are we just, the result of chance? And then he went on. He said, if we're the result of chance, if you and I are just a mistake of nature, that puts a different moral demand on us. And then he thought for a second. He said, in fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us that if in fact we are a creation of a being that has moral demands. Now the syntax is a little confused, but he's speaking extemp, so I'll cut him some slack. And what he's saying is, in his view, evolution says we're a mistake of nature. And if we're a mistake of nature, morality itself means nothing. Now, I'm always quick to tell my undergraduate students, because you say the word morality in class, they get kind of defensive, because they think morality just means don't do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I'm always quick to tell them that morality is also, what is the just society? How should we treat the poor? Under what circumstances, if ever, is war justified? These are all moral questions. I want politicians thinking about moral questions. This is important. And when Santorum says morality is an illusion, if Darwin is right, that's a real fear. Now, this kind of fear, he put it rather elegantly. It's been put more bluntly by others. This is a website of the largest anti-evolution organization in the U.S., Answers in Genesis. About a year and a half ago, after one of those awful crimes in a school, where a kid brought a gun to school and he mowed down a couple of his classmates, this was the web page they put up. You went to the web page, you saw the gun aiming right at you. Who was responsible for the killings? Evolution. Here's what they said. As a society, we reap the consequences of the unquestioned acceptance in the belief of evolution every day. It diminishes your worth. It reduces human beings from being made in the image of God to being mere players in the game of survival of the fittest. In other words, if you teach kids they're evolved from apes, they're going to behave like murderous animals. That's the kind of fear. And the same organization put out this book, which was actually given to me several years ago by one of my students, called Evolution, the Lie. In other words, evolution is not just bad science, it is literally the apple in the mouth of the serpent. A very offensive image to anyone who understands the biblical context for the serpent and the apple. But I want to go to the core of this argument, that evolution is built upon mistakes. And I want to ask the following question. Is evolution really driven by mistakes? Well, even most biologists would probably say, yeah, it is, because evolution is driven by mutations which produce genetic variation, and then it acts on those mutations. So the argument is that mutations, changes in DNA, changes in genes, are somehow mistaken. Now, if you really think that's true, I want to ask you to perform the following thought experiment. Imagine an organism that never made these mistakes. Now, the person who first asked me, or my whole class, to perform this thought experiment was my undergraduate biochemistry professor here at Brown, Frank Rothman, for whom one of the commencement forum lectures earlier today is named. And Frank actually asked the biochemistry class I took, imagine an organism that never made mistakes. Now, we think of mistakes as being bad, so therefore if you don't make mistakes, presumably that's good. But if you don't make mistakes, you have no mutations, you have no variation, you have no evolution. What's going to happen to an organism that replicates its DNA perfectly every time? It's not going to survive. Therefore, by what standard do we call these mistakes? Because if you're mistake-free, that should be good, but in this case, being mistake-free is a quick road to extinction. Maybe evolution isn't a mistake of nature. Rather, maybe evolution is an essential element of what I would call, and I'll put it in quotes, the design of nature, the way things in effect are supposed to work, or at least have evolved to work. This is actually an argument that's been taken up by a couple of my very distinguished colleagues in the field of cell biology, Mark Kirshner and John Gerhardt, in a 2005 book called The Plausibility of Life. They advocate something they call a theory of facilitated variation. And a quick summary of this basically says that living organisms today exist because they've been selected by nature for evolvability. This is the chance to make mistakes where they will really be productive. A capacity for change, therefore, is not the result of mistakes in the sense of literal errors, but of the molecular architecture of life, and I should put it as the successful molecular architecture of life. Now, what does all of this mean philosophically? Here's the reality. Life is material phenomena. This is, by the way, one of the few things that Madonna actually got right. We live in a material world. And the capacity for life comes right out of the physics and chemistry of matter. We are creatures of matter, and that's very important to appreciate. Evolution, therefore, this change over time, is actually an inherent and predictable property of nature. It's not a mistake. It's something you would expect from a replicating organism made out of matter and subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. And what evolutionary processes do is they explore what biologists call adaptive space, and in that exploration, they're driven by natural selection, which is not random at all, and by natural law. So what does all this mean in terms of implications? The meaning is what you might call an evolutionary design to life is part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. And by design, I don't mean imposed by an intelligent agent, but in a sense, a correlation between structure and function. Now, what does all this mean? And here's the lesson. Evolution is really an emergent property, a physical property of our universe. Let's suppose that you're a person of faith, religious in one sense or another. If that's true, you can see this as a natural mechanism reflecting the will of the Creator. And that's one of the ways in which religious people can understand evolution in a religious context. Why does this matter? It matters for the very simple reason that in reality, the science-faith conflict, or the supposed science-faith conflict, very often is the very first issue that is raised, and certainly is the most emotional issue in response to evolution. Now, I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to discuss this with one of our nation's leading intellectuals on... Ooh. And here's the discussion.
Thank you so much for doing the show. This is a thrill for me.
It's a thrill for me.
Let me ask you something. Walk me through, I want to give you a shot here. Explain evolution from the primordial soup to how I got here today in my limo.
Oh, well, that's it.
Walk me through it. Take 30 seconds.
Okay. How about if we crawl? Basically, what evolution tells us is that we are united. We're put together in a fabric of life with every other living thing on this planet. Up until about, 200-300 years ago, people thought that life on Earth had never changed. But they immediately became aware at the end of the 17th and 18th century that life had changed. And the process of change, explaining that, has been one of biology's biggest projects for the last 150 years. And that explanation is evolution.
Speaking of designers, you're a Catholic.
Yes, sir.
I am a Catholic also. Have you forgot the creed? Jesus, through him all things were made.
For us men and for our salvation. I remember all this very well.
Okay.
But there's
so
also...
don't you see a conflict there? You got to choose.
No, there's not a conflict. There's not a conflict, and you don't have to choose. And here's the problem. The biggest thing that the opponents of evolution have going for them is a fiction. It's not true. And that is the idea that evolution and religion have to be in opposition to each other. What it amounts to, in a sense, is that I have a higher opinion of God than the people who favor intelligent design, because they think he's sort of a little pedestrian God who has a lot of cheap tricks. He had to design this. Whoops, it went extinct. He designed that. It went extinct. The fossil museums of the world are filled with his mistakes. My view is that I've got a higher opinion. This is a guy who was so clever that he set a process in motion that gave rise to everything on this planet, and you and me and maybe even Bill O'Reilly.
You know what? I agree with you about O'Reilly. All right? I think O'Reilly could be so involved that he's one of the X-Men. Okay, now, let me ask you something. You think God is that clever. I think God is so clever that he just made it look like there's a fossil record. Isn't God powerful enough that he just sort of put all those dino bones down in there to give us the illusion we've been here for a while? Well, in fact, nothing existed before I was born.
So your theory is essentially what I would call the Steve Martin theory of evolution, which is that God put all these things down here just to show us he's a wild and crazy God. Well, I don't reject that for scientific reasons. I reject it for theological ones, which is that I don't choose to believe in a deceptive creator.
Mr. Miller, will you come back? You've got to go now, but will you please come back on another show and explain to me this whole sun doesn't go around the earth thing? Okay. Ken Miller, thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I think Stephen enjoyed it too, because when my new book came out last year, he gave me a call and he said, now that you have a new book out, how about you come on the show? And lo and behold, I've now been on the Colbert Report twice. And if you ever want to go someplace to plug a book, man, it doesn't get any better than this. My book was at the top of Amazon.com science books for almost 2 months after being on here, which is just absolutely extraordinary. So that's the good message. The unfortunate message, and this is sort of sad, and I'm sorry to tell you this in an academic context, and that is, to be perfectly honest, nothing I've ever done in my entire academic career has ever gained for me the respect with my students of being on the Colbert Report. And when you think about it, that's kind of depressing, but it's the reality of the way things actually are. So here's the point that I have actually labored to make, along with many other people, and not everybody in the scientific community even agrees with this, but I think it's a point whose reality is self-evident, and that is, to a religious person, what science does, the investigation of the order in nature, the source of that order is very clear, and that is, to a religious person, all of nature is the work of God. It's God. If you're not a religious person, that order in nature is still there. You do science in exactly the same way. You simply think that it has another source. And I think ultimately, either way, the study of that nature, the practice of science, is the same. And this is ultimately why science is compatible with religion in this particular way. Both involve the study of nature. Now, I'm not the only scientist who feels that way. And I just want to show you very quickly one good example. Probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century is the late Theodosius Dobzhansky. And Dobzhansky is well remembered not just for his research and not just for the principles that he enunciated and took hold in the population genetics community, but also for a very famous essay that he wrote 35 years ago. And the title of that essay tells the whole thing. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that's absolutely true. This is an extraordinary essay about the centrality of evolutionary thinking for biology. But many people who know this have forgotten that in the same essay, Dobzhansky said the following. He said that the diversity of life is understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. Then he went on, and he said, it is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. How could he possibly say that? Answer, because to him, he says, evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not something that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that began 10 billion years ago and is still underway. The Pope, taking the other side of this issue, has recently come out very clearly and made exactly the same point. He says the creation versus evolution clash is an absurdity. Here are some of the detailed words. He said this contrast is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. That might be a little too complicated for you, so if you're like me, you like to depend upon the media to summarize things, you can just go to the New York Post. Evolution and God do mix, Pope. And I think And you know, I think, you know, the Pope should have the Post writing his headlines for him. In the aftermath of that trial in Pennsylvania, I think the guy who nailed it the best was the most conservative columnist who writes for the Washington Post, and that's Charles Krauthammer. And when you say that, and George Will writes for the same newspaper, that's really high conservative praise. But look at what he wrote when the trial was over. He wrote, "Phony theory, false conflict. Intelligent design foolishly pits evolution against faith." And whatever you think about Krauthammer's politics, boy, does he know how to turn a phrase. And what he said was how ridiculous it is to make evolution the enemy of God. And he said, what could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more economical, more creative, indeed more divine, than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And finally, and this is by means of saying it might not be a bad idea to go visit the exhibit at the Hay. I think when I'm asked by people, what do I think about evolution? Don't I find it depressing to think I'm just an animal or that I'm descended from apes or some sort of nonsense like that? I tend to reach for somebody else's words. I don't consider this to be plagiarism because these are words that I think live for the ages. And the best summary of my own view of this comes from the end of a famous book that you've all heard of, written by a guy who kept this page in his notebook. Now, I don't know how many of you recognize that page or how many of you have actually seen it, because it's been traveling around the country recently. This was written in 1839, and you can see the guy didn't have particularly good handwriting. He was famous for that. He wrote, "I think." He then sketched a kind of sketch that no one had ever sketched before. He wrote some explanatory notes down here. They were not sufficient. About 2 or 3 weeks later, he came back and he added a few more notes up here that really helped to explain what he meant. Now, it took him almost 20 years to get up the courage to publish these ideas. But when he finally did, at the end of the book presenting these ideas, he didn't say that he found evolution depressing or demeaning. It didn't run him down to be related to animals or anything like that. He said quite the contrary. He said, "I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved." That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and I think those are words to live by. Thank you all very much.